Great. So first of all, a welcome to new RDA members and a reminder of the guiding principles of RDA. I think this is also a reminder of sort of code of conduct that we want to be inclusive, consensus-driven, and behave well during the meeting, put forward discussion and collaboration. We have a pretty full agenda, but a very exciting one with some fantastic presentations. I'm not going to go that much further beyond this welcome and introduction. We will then have a review of the catalog that the interest group has been putting together over quite a while of all the groups and projects that have some type of work going on physical samples, their identifiers, their metadata, and so on. And Jens Klump is not available. This will be done by Leslie instead. And we will then have presentations from Joan Demeraux and Rolf Kral, which is great, as we're going to learn about more community-driven activities that advance the agenda, advance our best practices, guidelines, and community activities relating to physical samples in the digital world specifically. And then we're going to have a fairly substantial deep dive in which we're going to hear from Simon Cox about new developments in the ISO, OGC, and W3C standards and specifications specifically related to samples in the context of observations and measurements. And this will have some time for discussion, definitely, after Simon's presentation. And then Esther Plump will do the final wrap-up and basically see what our next steps could be, what's coming out of our discussions. So I think before I hand over to Leslie, it's just a reminder to please add your name into the session notes so that we have a record of who attended this session. It's funny to see this little list of all the the history of our interest group, which actually started quite a long time ago and has been active since 2017. And my impression just from the agenda today is that the interest group is actually more active and more relevant as it was in the beginning. There is so much going on about physical samples and collections that there's a lot to report and to collaborate on. And with that, Leslie, I'm gonna
we'll just go to the next slide.
Oh, your slides are in here as well. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
wonder what happens if you back one. Esther, oh, hang on just a minute. Okay, everyone, I'm just putting the link to the catalog. It's easier than me trying to screen share. Simon Cox
raised his hand.
Yeah, just about the session notes. Are you wanting us to type stuff into the Hoover platform or into a document somewhere else?
No, the collaborative notes document.
The collaborative notes document.
See, it's in the chat. We've been putting it there.
It's in the chat. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Now, and if you could add your name. to everyone, if you could add your name to the session notes so we know who's come to this session. If you can all just click on that link I put into the catalog. It's just a simple catalog. And if you're new and you've got a group working on samples, we'd just like you to add, it just asks a few questions. We're just trying to get an idea of how many networks or like things like the OGSN EV, which is a group of people that are developing geo samples. And there are other groups as well. We just want to get a feeling for who's got a project, where groups are that are coordinating. And so if you're not there, please add it. Okay. So anyway, Kirsten, that was about all I wanted to say. Just keep it short
you
and sweet.
wanted to say, now I need to
No,
navigate.
hang on. Yeah. Sorry,
What?
yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize you'd got it up on the screen. Sorry, I was looking at it.
Oh.
Yes, so you can actually see, just scroll down. Some of the early ones. Can you keep scrolling? Yeah. So, and they're not just geological samples. As you can see, we've just had oral cancer database and tissue system added at our last plenary from Malaysia. So please add what you've got to it. So I think we'll go back to your slides, to the session slides, Kirsten.
Yeah.
And okay, the next, we've just got if you go to the next one, please.
Yep.
We just go, sorry, you can have a bit more, Joan, than 3 minutes. What we usually do in our meetings is we just have a few lightning talks so people could advertise papers that they've written or new groups that are starting up or something that's relevant to samples. So Joan has kindly offered to talk about a paper that has been prepared by the ESIP Physical Samples Cluster, which we've just resubmitted. Hopefully it'll get through. Then there is another RDA group on complex citations, and this samples group and the ESIP samples cluster put in a use case to that group. So Joan will show how that's working for samples, and then Rolf will present on a material sample vocabulary classification, which is a new working group. I'm not quite sure whether it's got up yet, but anyway, let's start with Joan. So Joan, if you can just run your two presentations one after the other, that would be great.
Okay, sounds good. Let me. There we go. Does that look okay?
Yeah, great.
Okay. Yeah, so my name is Joan Damrow, and I'm the data management services lead for the ESS Dive Data Repository. And this is a repository funded by the U.S. Department of Energy's Environmental System Science program, and we serve projects that are funded by this program. So we have Earth and Environmental Sciences data that's highly interdisciplinary, and we've been working a lot on sample-based data and also connecting data sets to related research outputs. And then I'm also one of the co-chairs, along with Andrea Thomer and Val Stanley, of the Earth Science Information Partners Physical Samples Curation Cluster. And the purpose of this group is generally to promote the curation and maintenance of physical sample collections and associated metadata and data. And as Leslie mentioned in the talk, I just want to provide some information on a publication that we've submitted revisions last week to Nature Scientific Data. And the authors of the paper are listed here on the slide. So we've been working for a while now on author guidelines for publishing open research using physical samples. And again, we just submitted this paper. Let's see here, I can put in the chat. This is the preprint. We just updated this preprint when we submitted it last week, if you're interested. So some of the primary goals of the work were to make samples and associated data more open and fair, and provide authors of scientific papers guidelines on how to do this, and in a way that enables provenance tracking and citation credit. So we have these different outputs that we've had in the cluster, and one of those was the paper. To develop the author guidelines, we had group discussions about specific use cases where we, as sample data professionals, we really needed to better track sample provenance and credit. And these included efficiently publishing and citing a large number of samples and associated data, providing credit for all of those involved in the physical sample collection and curation to demonstrate the value of investing in collections, tracking use of sample data generated by analysts and laboratories, and also connecting related interdisciplinary sample data and metadata and other research outputs. So we distilled the needs from these use cases and also existing best practices from data repositories and sample repositories into 4 basic steps to publish sample-based studies. And this includes, just at a high level, first describing samples with rich metadata, ideally using existing sample metadata standard or a template suitable for a specific discipline, and we provide examples of these in the guidelines. Second is to assign and use persistent identifiers for samples. Third is to publish data sets that include sample persistent identifiers. And essentially, if repositories are doing this correctly, or as we found in our work here, ideally the repositories would include sample identifiers as a related identifier and cite them in the data set if samples are used in a data set. Fourth is to cite sample identifiers in your paper if you have a relatively smaller number of samples, like 10 or fewer, or to cite the data set that contains these samples in your paper. And again, in the guidelines, we include specific information on how to do each of these things in a way that will facilitate sample credit and provenance tracking to the extent possible with existing infrastructure. And we also wanted to make it as user-friendly as possible. In the paper, we assess the current sample data ecosystem and how we can make improvements to facilitate more automated and efficient sample tracking. And this involves a number of different players, potentially research institutions, laboratories, museums, data repositories, publishers, and indexers. And we, again, outline in the paper some specific things that each of these groups can do. And we end with the paper with some conclusions on improvements needed, that many of these are focused on specific groups, like promoting and incentivizing adoption of standard practices, research institutions and laboratories facilitating use of persistent identifiers, making it easier for researchers to get and use these, implementing clear guidelines and editorial review for publishing and citing sample-based research, and more coordination across systems to enable more automated workflows where possible. One of the key improvements needed that we identified in developing the author guidelines was the need to enable more complex citations. So I now want to move on to how we might implement some recommendations that were recently put forth by the Research Data Alliance Complex Citation Working Group to support samples. So the idea behind this, if you haven't been involved in any of those conversations, is that complex citations you could have this complex citation object that would cite numerous components. For example, a sample data set could include dozens or hundreds of samples. And the key element here is that we want to enable provenance tracking and credit for not only that, not just the overall container citation, but all the individual components there, all of the samples. So for this, we have been in the ESS Dive data repository working on ways to connect data sets and samples more precisely. And so we worked on some specific data sets where we wanted to connect them to associated samples. And then we also worked on how we can how individual source samples should be connected to downstream analyses and research outputs. And this involved 6 projects and about 10 data sets where we added related identifiers and connection metadata at both the data set and sample level. So these data sets are all published in a data portal collection in ESS Dive. There's a link shown here. And these can be considered like a preliminary like test implementation of what a complex citation could be for samples. It's just like sample data sets that would include samples as related identifiers, and other repositories like the EarthChem library already do this. As I mentioned, these sample-based data sets should really function like a complex citation when they're cited, so that the data set would be cited along with all the samples included in that data set. And this would enable automatically connecting related data and enable credit and provenance tracking for the component samples. And so data site metadata already includes fields for connecting research outputs, so like the related ID and relation type. And all DOIs registered through DataCite are searchable via DataCite Commons. So when we have this connection metadata provided by the data repositories, the records in DataCite Commons show citation counts, and they can show a network graph that could look something like this if the related identifiers are actually reported, and could connect a rich variety of related resources. And so another really useful thing is that it shows a list of titles and abstracts for all of those related resources. So you can see all the places that your data set or samples were referenced or connected to. But there's currently no resource type for complex citations. So what we're trying to promote in that group is potentially to add a new resource type in DataCite that would trigger indexing the list of identifiers that are included in the complex citation anytime that resource is cited. And this is just showing an example also that we have in the paper of how like a source or parent sample can be linked to a variety of different research outputs. It's associated with a project, a sampling site, subsamples, and potentially a variety of different biogeochemical or genomic analyses that are run on those subsamples, and potentially even more than this. And when we use a standard approach like this for recognizing and linking identifiers, along with some infrastructure improvements in the future, we could automatically link and exchange relevant metadata and data for not only the data set, but also the source sample and subsample records. So I just wanted to illustrate a simple example of how this could work. You might have a set of source sample records that are used in a data set. The data set contains sample metadata, it could contain a sample metadata file or a list of sample identifiers included in the data set. If they have IGSN IDs or another persistent identifier, then the source sample record could be updated as being part of the data set with a link to the data set when that new data is published. The data set is incited by a journal publication. We could use the connection metadata to automatically track use of samples in both the data set and the journal publications and propagate links back to the source sample records. And so DataCite is already tracking metrics in a similar way for data sets and samples that use IGSN IDs. And we can get part of the way there if repositories are collecting and providing related ID metadata to DataCite. But it would be even more useful and accurate if some of our data sets functioned like complex citations, where you not only cite the data set in the paper citation, but it's also propagating that credit and provenance information to the source sample records that are included in the data set. So we believe we need complex citations for citing samples and data sets to enable both provenance tracking and understand how samples are used over time. And we can do this by making sample data sets function more like a complex citation when they're cited. This would be essential to truly track how samples are used over time. But it's going to require some changes in how data repositories and publishers and indexers treat citations. And we hope that some of this can be addressed with complex citations. And that seems to be part of some of the goals of the RDA Complex Citation Working Group. and also the ESIP physical samples creation cluster. We're hoping to continue working on discussions with data site indexers on these issues. And sorry, I think I went quite over, but that's all I have here.
Simon's got a question. Simon's put a question in the chat for you, Joan.
It's just a relatively
the relationships, we're just using data site related identifiers and the relation type.
Okay.
Metadata, they're high level, but because we use data site DOIs, and we have this existing functionality to track citations. That's what we're using.
Great work, Joan.
Thank you.
Okay, should I go on?
Yes, please go.
Okay. I want to provide an update from a new RDA sample type classification working group. And so the problem that we are trying to address, I guess I don't need to tell to this group that we have a huge variety of different sample types or different samples around. And that makes it a little bit challenging to describe these samples because there's no common metadata schema for all of these samples that are around. And there's no common standard that would be applicable to all sorts of samples. And the idea of solving that would be that we believe we would need a standardized vocabulary for the top-level classification of the sample types. So the idea is, once we know that some sample is a battery, then we also know that we can apply existing battery vocabularies to describe it. And so that classification vocabulary would need to be very broad. So it must be able to be applicable to all sorts of physical objects from all domains that are, say, subject to investigations in the sciences. But it only would need to be very shallow because we don't want to go into the detailed description of the samples. That would be left to domain-specific vocabularies. We only want to go to the top-level classification. So it's not about replacing domain-specific vocabularies, but for connecting those. And so the current status is we initiated, as I said, a RDA sample type classification working group to develop that vocabulary. The request has been submitted in March, end of March. And so the group is now in community review, and you can go to the RDA website and leave your comments to the statement of work. And if everything goes well and the group gets endorsed, we plan to have the formal kickoff session at the next plenary in International Data Week in Brisbane in October. And in parallel to, say, creating these RDA working group, we are also in the process to apply for funding so that we also have some, say, personal resources to work on that problem. That was my short lightning contribution, and I'm already done.
Thank you, Ralph. Does anyone have any questions of Ralph?
Just a little bit, Ralph. So the goal is to keep it very high level.
Yep.
So are we looking at trying to have a classification system with, say, 10 classes or 100 classes or what?
Oh, difficult to tell a number up front, because the first task would be to get an overview of the things that are around, and to gather, say, input from different communities. And we would need to look at this material first in order to say how much we would end up with. But in general, so the idea is to have we have the battery, and we want to tell the battery from the fossil, from the single crystal, from all those things. So at that level of detail.
Okay, any more questions? If not, let's hand over to Simon.
And I might post a link to the group into the chat.
That'd be great. So you can all join up on that group. I think we'll hand over to Simon, who's going to lead us through some recent changes to the a few standards that are important standards on samples. And then afterwards, we wanted to have discussions, because after all, the name of this group is Physical Samples in the Ecosystem, and see what these changes mean and whether they're going to influence what we're going to do. So over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Leslie. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Someone give me a nod.
Yes.
Good. All right. So I've actually dropped my slides into the session stack, which made the session stack about 4 times as long as it was before I dropped my slides in. I'll just, again, I've repeated the sort of 3 motivating papers, the links there, which Leslie and Kirsten had put in the original agenda. And I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the work that we've been doing in the joint OGC World Wide Web Consortium working group, working on an update of the semantic sensor network ontology. But in order to for everyone to understand where that came from, I'm going to briefly give an overview of the sort of history of the work that led to this point, because it also includes, very significantly that, in fact, those first 2 references on the screen at the moment are the same document. So it's available for free from OGC, or you can pay for it from ISO. I'm sure I can guess where most of you will go if you can be bothered at all. So the work really, actually, I should have said here, the O&M work goes back to 2007, not 2011. So I've immediately spotted my first error here, but I'll fix that on the first slide here. This is just, if you like, the main figure taken directly from the first official version of the Observations and Measurements Standard, which was developed in the Open Geospatial Consortium through work done as part of the Sensor Web Enablement Initiative. And there were 3 primary standards that came out of that: the Sensor ML, which describes sensors and in particular streams of data. It was particularly focused on airborne sensors. The Sensor Observation Service, which was one of these old-style OGC services for getting observation data from a web source. The Observations Measurement Standard, the main piece of it, part 1, was describing observations. And observations, the key thing here is that an observation is an active observation. And it has as its subject a feature of interest, and an observed property. And after you've performed an active observation, you've generated a result, and that result is a piece of information. And that's in the language is important really to understand here, because in some disciplines people talk about the value that comes from an observation as being the observation. Here we clarified that and said that an observation is an active observation which generates a result, and the result is that number that you're really interested in. So second part of the observations and measurement standard, which is the piece which is of particular interest, I think, to this group, was, and I pat myself on the back for having done this early in observations measurements and saying actually most observations are made using samples. So there's some intermediate thing between the thing which you're really trying to characterize, which is something in the world, and a piece of it or a sample from it, which is the thing which you can take into a lab, or you can examine at an outcrop in the field, or you can pull into a data system and do your actual analysis, make your actual observations. Back then, we called it sampling feature, which is a bit of a clumsy word. That got fixed up later when we just recognized that the best word for this was sample. But because I'm just doing this little historic overview, just showing you the diagrams here, and you'll notice that the diagrams are formal UML. So the specification was done as UML at that point, and there was sort of as an annex to these things an XML implementation. I put a ring on this diagram, that skinny red ring, because right from the beginning we recognized that one of the key pieces of information, possibly the key piece of information about a sample, is what its intention was, what it was intended to have sampled. So, a little bit like if you're looking at collections in museums, the specimens are of very little interest if you don't know where they came from and when they came from, why they were collected. Samples really are not useful unless you know why they were collected. A lump of anything on a shelf is of no interest unless you know where it came from. So that intentionality about sampling was there in a very limited way, but was recognized as being an important part of the problem from the beginning. There was we went to town a little bit in talking about how the different kinds of samples there might be. I was working particularly in the earth sciences, exploration, geology at the time, and so a lot of these examples are strongly influenced by that. But this particular sort of taxonomy of samples was looking at the various ways in which spatial samples might be developed. So in particular, there's an awful lot of what are called abstractly sampling curves, which includes wells, profiles, traverses, flight lines, ships, tracks, all of those kinds of things, because they are all ways in which the world is sampled along something which looks a bit like a line. So my dog, I've got to get up and let him out, open the door so that he doesn't get too distressed. Sorry about that, folks. And perhaps of particular interest to this group, of course, is the fact that right back then in 2007, we had a type in the system for a specimen. Now, back then, I was thinking specimen, you could more or less think of this as a material sample. Because I got schooled a little bit later on, was told no, specimens are samples which are curated. At least that's how they're described in some disciplines. And we know that, when we're trying to come together in forums like RDA, where we're looking in very cross-disciplinary, you do have to be a bit sensitive to the existing language that's used in different disciplines and the nuances that are there, and the difference between sample or specimen and that may appear to be trivial in some disciplines and really, really important in other disciplines. So didn't get it exactly right at this point, but I'm just telling you about it to say beware, be a little bit aware. 2011, this work that was initiated in OGC got promoted to ISO through the Technical Committee 211, which is the Geographic Information Technical Committee, and was published as an ISO standard and simultaneously as an abstract specification by OGC. The modularization of it was done a little bit different this time. Part one was both observations and samples as a UML model. And then part two of this case, which was OGC only, was the XML implementation. One little addition that went in the sample part of the model there was introducing the idea of preparation steps and process sampling feature process, which is kind of something about the actions that are taken when you're developing a sample, and this becomes more important as I'm going to show you the next steps with this. But this step, 2011, was primarily just a minor refinement of the original O&M, but moved up into an ISO format. The next significant piece of work was finally published in 2017, but it started in 2013, so only a couple of years after the ISO standard, which was the work done through the joint W3C and OGC working group to develop the semantic sensor network ontology. And the key insight here was that rather than focusing just on the artifact, the sample, everything got turned around. So the primary focus was on the acts which develop samples. And this was seen as one in the semantic sensor network ontology as one of three actions which were part of that model. The original one, which was observations, an act of observation, which generates a piece of information. Then the new one, and this was moved to the center of the model rather than being just on the periphery of a process, an act of sampling, which generates a sample. And we found that this helped clarify a lot of the metadata capture around samples, which is why it's, why I talk about it being central to the model. The third kind of action, which was formalized in this ontology, was the notion of an actuation, which is a change of state. Now, the classic actuations would be in sort of engineering situations like turning a light on or adjusting a thermostat or opening a window. But actuations might also be treatments or interventions in an environmental context, or treatments even in a health context where you're changing the one of the properties of the thing that you're interested in. So I'm not going to talk any more about actuations, but just point out that that was the trio, and it gives the A in the core part of this the SSN ontology became known as SOSA, sensors, observations, sampling, and actuations. So I needed to explain where the A came from. And the other key thing here was we moved on from UML and XML to RDF, RDFS, OWL in this formalization. Just thinking a little bit about the significance of the act of sampling, this actually relates to, and the left diagram here is an interpretation of an act of sampling using the Provo ontology. So sampling is a kind of activity which generates an entity or a sample, and there's also a feature of interest, which is the entity that was used in the act of sampling in order to generate a sample. In SSN, we called it procedure, and sampler over in Prov, those are special kinds of plan or agent. So it links in with some of the standard ontologies coming out of W3C that you may have come across. Prov was mostly motivated by talking about information artifacts, papers, tables, figures, and those kinds of things. And really, we said, no, it can talk about things in the real world as well, if you interpret it in the way I'm showing here. Again, I emphasize the intentionality here. And one of the key properties, and this sort of goes back to the, why I tend to focus on properties, why I asked that question of you, Joan, 10 minutes ago, is it's interesting to see the extent to which you're able to use data site properties in order to link all these things together. Really, I would say when looking at these diagrams I'm showing on now, look at the labels on those arrows, the properties, the things that link the different artifacts of interest. And recognize that that's where a lot of the information is. This is where the graphs are built, joining together these bits of information. And so here we have a set of relationships relating to samples and the act of sampling and their relationships to the things which they are samples of, which, you know, we hope makes some sense in quite a generic way. And, you know, here, Rolf, you know, your work in thinking at a higher level of the, you know, non-domain specific ways in which you can describe these things. And we hope that that's what we've accomplished here. So going back over into ISO and OGC world, the work that was done in the W3C project and also some work that I proposed in an extension to that was then rolled into a refresh of observations and measurements in ISO. I wasn't directly involved in this. I'd been involved in all the earlier ones, but I was very happy to hand over responsibility. I think that shows the maturing of a project where you let go and let other people take it on. So in a sense, we can consider observations, measurements, and sampling the ISO revision published in 2023. It's really version 3 of O&M, but samples and sampling became a much stronger part of it, and so it got promoted up into the name of the standard, which is now called observations, measurements, and sampling. The scope really was, it took the best bits out of the old O&M and merged it with the best bits from the semantic sensor network ontology. So the notion of a sampling, an act of sampling, a sampler, the thing that does the sampling, and also recognizing that in science, you're rarely interested in just one observation or one sample. You're usually interested in suites of them, because that way you're detecting signals. So sample collections and observation collections, groupings of those which share some common properties, were introduced. The other things which are particularly of interest, I think, to this group here was there's a little taxonomy of samples here, Rolf. Looking at material samples is really all this group is interested in, but there are other kinds of samples which are used in science and in environmental science, medical science, in all sorts, which in particular spatial samples, which is transects and scenes and grids and images even, and statistical samples. This is where you know, this comes up in the social sciences in particular, but also medical sciences. So where you know, the word sample is used there, and it really does mean at a high level the same as the way we use samples and material samples, which is a thing which you can get your hands on, but which is representative of something which you cannot encompass altogether. And so that's really the meaning of the word sample. But when we're looking at material samples, physical samples, an important part of this is thinking about preparation, the processes of taking a sample and breaking it up and dissolving it and sieving it and all those kinds of things. So there's a lot of preparation procedures and keeping track of the way in which the thing that you end up making your observations on, where it came from, how it relates to other samples which may have identifiers, Joan. And I'll show an example in some detail in a couple of moments about that. So then, rolling it back into the W3C OGC space, the innovations that were done in the 2023 refresh observations, measurements, and samples needed to be rolled back into the ontology. And a couple of things have happened, sort of insights we got while we were doing this work. And you know, the key one which I'm emphasizing here is that we recognize that these things, observations, samplings, actuations, there's a superclass of these things, if you like, which we call execution. So execution is the generalization of actuations, observations, samplings, and there might be other things as well, which are kinds of executions. And similarly, the things which perform the executions are called sensors, actuators, and samplers. And so we have some general relationships that an execution is made by a sampling is made by a sampler, an observation is made by a sensor, an actuation is made by an actuator, and so there's a general pattern here which we made explicit, while saying that the notion of execution, we have to think of this as an abstract class. So this is the diagram from the draft spec as it is at the moment, but it's a very mature draft. There's a link in the agenda to this. And this is really trying to summarize in one diagram. It doesn't have everything, but it's trying to summarize in one diagram the things around the act of sampling, which has a result, which is a sample. And that sample is a sample of this thing, which is a feature of interest, which could be is often a thing in a real world. And there's a series of other relationships here, which I'll explain with some examples in a moment to show you how that all comes together. And we will have we can imagine that there'd be a lot of acts of sampling, which are done more or less all the same, perhaps on different features of interest, perhaps at different times, which we could describe as a collection of samplings, which may generate a collection of samples. So these are up in the top left here. This is the set of acts of sampling. And down the bottom right here, this is the set of the results of those acts of sampling. Okay. It's quite a lot of discipline, mental discipline, if you like, required in order to conceptualize things in this way. But by teasing apart the act of sampling and the result of the act of sampling, we've hypothesized that allows a sort of more accurate, more precise description of overall what is going on in provenance, in metadata about all kinds of samples, in particular physical samples. So, for example, we can build sample chains with using these relationships. So we may take an ice core from the Antarctic ice sheet and then find a bubble inside that ice core, and each of those is a sample of the thing further to the right. That involves two acts of sampling. One is drilling the ice core. The next is taking an extraction from the ice core. And the sampler that did the second one could be a person. The sampler that did the first one might be a special kind of drill. And the interesting thing here is that this bubble is both a sample from the ice core, but it's also a sample of the Earth atmosphere at the time that bubble was trapped in that ice column. So this is, really exploring the way in which that particular scenario could be built up from the elements that we've got in the ontology. In particular, this is why I was asking you that question, Joan, is thinking about what relationships are needed in order to build these things up. An even more complex one might be, and this is going back to my roots in geology, where there might be a unit, a geological unit that you're interested in characterizing. I've called it the Bentley Formation because Bentley's a town which I live near here. And there's an outcrop of it, and we take a core from that, and we take an interval from the core, and we take a split from the interval, and we take a fraction of that split which has been from a sieving act, and then we take a couple of fractions from that which are done through heavy liquid density separations. All of these pink things are acts of sampling. All of these green things are samples. And every one of them would have an identifier. Okay, even the ones which no longer exist because you've destroyed them in order to get to the next step. But that existed at some point, and in order to be explicit and complete in your description of what these things are at the left-hand end, it's helpful to recognize there was a separate existing sample at every stage along the way, and ultimately the thing which this light fraction, this heavy fraction are intending to characterize are the Bentley Formation. And there was an original sample brought in from the field, which is called the original sample. And so, and having these links back to the thing that's still sitting on the shelf or the thing that's out there in the world will likely be important in terms of discovery of, oh, I've got a sample here, which is related to that one that's sitting on a shelf and is related to that thing that's out in the field. I want to know all the samples which are characterizing the Bentley Formation. I can query that because they're the has sample feature. I want to know all of the subsamples which have been taken from this core, and we can find those if they've all got the relationship has original sample. They won't all have it, but of course there is a mechanism here to look at these things. Each of these steps has got the previous, each of these acts of sampling steps have got as a feature of interest the previous sample in the chain, and as a result the next sample in the chain. Okay. Now there may be some details that a real geochemist or geologist would argue with me on here, but conceptually I hope it makes sense. So that's talking about the way in which we have the pieces of the puzzle there in the ontology to describe about sampling preparation chains. I also briefly mentioned we have this notion of three generalized classes of samples: material samples, spatial samples, and statistical samples. Maybe there's other generalized classes that we've missed here, but this certainly covers a significant fraction of the things which we're interested in studying, in using to make observations in science. And going right the way back to when we were developing observations and measurements, one of the things which drove that was the idea that the location of an observation is a bit of a nebulous thing, because are we talking about the location where the sample which the observation was made on came from, where the sensor was when the observation was made, all of these kinds of things. When you're looking at remote sensing, the feature of interest is at a different place to the sensor at the time at which the observation is made, and so on and so forth. So thinking about what the sample location is, just going to run you through a few scenarios about the way we can build that up using standard ontologies. In this case, we're joining together the SSN ontology with GeoSparkle, which is the most commonly used ontology for spatial characteristics. And the beauty of the RDF universe is that you can grab useful pieces from other ontologies and just use them, as long as you tell people where you're using them from, which you do by the fact that everything, including the relationships, are identified with URIs. And so I want to know what this relationship is. I dereference the URI. I find that it comes from GeoSparkle. Great. So here's a very, very simple case where a sample of the Earth's atmosphere taken at the Saint Etienne School of Mines has this geometry. Okay. But actually what happened was there was an active sampling of the Earth's atmosphere, and the active sampling has as an input value the location where the active sampling took place. There's actually a bit more going on typically, and one of the key bits of the SSN ontology is the notion that systems are hosted on platforms, and are hosted on platforms as parts of deployments. Okay, and deployments are typically done in order to study a particular feature of interest. A system such as a sensor is typically targeted a particular property, and so that explains why these bits are. But systems includes samplers, includes sensors, includes includes I've gone okay, come back, sorry. And executions are made by systems relating to feature of interest. So just reminding you that an execution is the general case of actuation, observation, sampling. Systems, the general case of actuator, sensor, and sampler. And systems implement procedures hidden behind the footnote here. So before I was focusing on the sample and the sampler sorry, and the act of sampling. Here I'm going to look at the sampler, the thing that does the sampling. My archetypal thing here is a drill rig. Drill rigs are a specialization of sampler, and we've got a particular drill rig here, BFG 913R5, which, you know, in the simple case, we just say, well, that sampler is at a particular location, so it's got this geometry. But actually what's usually happening is the drill rig is taken to a location in space, at this camp. The camp is a platform, okay, and that hosts the drill rig, and it's the camp that has the location, okay. So the drill rig itself only has a transient location when it's taken to a particular platform, and that transientness is captured fully when you also recognize that there is a deployment of this sampler on this platform, which happens for a particular period of time. So the platform, the camp, has its location. The drill rig is taken there during this time as part of this deployment. And that gives you sort of a full set of ways of associating the location really with the thing that matters rather than faking it. So summarizing what I've told you, we've been talking about a series of standards or specifications or recommendations, depending on which institution you're talking about, what they call them, starting with the first formal publication of O&M, which was in 2007. We're expecting SSN New Edition to come out this year. It's already very mature and is available on the web at the link that was given in the agenda. Summarizing what SSN says is that there's an act of sampling, which if you recognize that as part of as the key part of the process as generating samples, which is just one of several kinds of execution, which is covered in the ontology, that complex sample preparation chains and also discovery of samples is supported by several kinds of relationship with the ontology. 3 kinds of sample, and then the last little bit, where I was showing that if you think about the locations of the samples, the samplings, the samplers, the platforms, the deployments, there's various ways of being more and more precise about what happened with the locations of these things. So if I shrink that back down, and we can go back and look at the full slide deck, I hope. Yep. That's plenty of words from me. I hope I haven't gone on too long. Yeah, here we are.
Thank you, Simon. That was about right. Does anyone have any questions of Simon that you would like to add?
Rob had his hand up a moment.
Rolf, can you go ahead?
Yeah, I might have a question. First of all, very interesting, very inspiring. I have a question on the act of sampling seemed to be in your model a singular event, and I think of samples that are prepared in the lab, and there you have more like a continuous process change. You start with a silicon wafer and you deposit some vapor on it, and then you apply some etching on that, and so you're continuously changing that thing in order to build a complex, say, device in the end.
Yeah. So the degree to which you should, or it might be useful, there's no should about this, there's a question of utility. You know, how much you want to break down that process depends on whether these intermediate steps are interesting or stable in some way in their own right. So
I mean,
you know, in this example that I spelled out that I'm showing on the screen now, obviously, you know, they're quite discrete, those steps.
Yeah.
This particular example, I can quite imagine where we might black box the whole thing and say, or black box everything from the core down to the light and heavy fractions, and say, yeah, we have a standard process for doing that. We applied it. Buried inside that, there's some intermediate stages, but no one's ever interested in those because there's no separate pathways away from those intermediate stages, if you like.
I mean, the interesting question that is related to that is whether each of those processing steps creates a new sample, or whether that is one single sample that has experienced a whole lot of history of processing steps.
Yeah.
And that is an ongoing discussion everywhere. Should we attribute new PIDs to it, or should we say it is one sample but that has a history of processing?
Yeah. So in this case that I'm showing on the screen here, you can imagine that, for example, the split, which is you know, a piece of a core, might have other things done to it other than crushing and sieving. Okay, in which case it's of interest in its own right. Okay.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you split samples apart, then of course it's a different story.
Yeah. So whether you want to identify those intermediate steps, I think would depend on whether it's only part of one potential sample processing process, or whether it has the potential to branch off into other ones. If there's no potential for branching, then black boxing it, saying that it's one sample preparation process, would, you know, there's not a lot of utility in splitting it out. Now, you would want to have that process described as part of the description of the procedure, which I haven't shown in this diagram. You know, that's in okay, the sampling act used a procedure and has a result. This procedure may encapsulate a lot of complexity with a lot of steps, and yet only produce one sample of interest at the end. So, okay.
Yep.
I mean, this is a toolbox. This isn't a single solution that we're showing here.
Okay, thank you.
Cone, question to you from me. Maybe it would be interesting to map some of these relationships to the ones that you're using in DataCite and see what we've missed, see what, you know, where perhaps recognizing there's a specialization sort of opportunity in the sample space, right?
Yeah, I was thinking that too. And we can definitely have like additional relation types. And I actually started with more specific relation types. That way we were considering using like working with the iSamples group and using some of the relation types that they were promoting in their metadata models. But as we have limited control over the sample. Like we're a data repository. We're not like a limb system or something where you can really track these things very specifically. So then more recently, we're focusing more on DataCite metadata because there's functionality there as a data repository to track the citation at least. And, you know, at a high level, track things that are connected.
Yeah, and of course, you know, what I haven't been focusing on here, because I've been mostly talking about the sampling and sample preparation part, is you know, samples are only interesting because we make observations on them. I mean, that's why we collect and create and prepare samples, is so that we can make observations on. And I haven't shown any of the of those pieces of the puzzle here.
Yeah, I mean, like these relationships would definitely be more useful, and this is what we would use if we were a limb system, but like it's hard to, with the control we have now, we can't really get at that level currently.
Yeah. So I've overwhelmed you all, have I? I hope not.
I was just wondering, does anyone else have any questions? Is this relevant to your work? Or anyone want to make a comment? The other thing is, Steve, I see you're still here. You put in a thing in the chat to Rolf after Rolf's talk, and we didn't really deal with it. Do you want to go back to that?
Oh, and I was just pointing out, I mean, I was participating in that sample classification group, and for this iSamples project that was come up several times, we're really focused on material samples in that hierarchy that Simon had. This is all thinking about, well, how do we categorize samples within that material sample branch there? And I think this is really a discussion for the sample classification group, but to me, the interesting thing there is there's so many different ways of thinking about it. It really helps to kind of break it up into the different facets of how people classify samples. So there's kind of, what kind of object is it? What is it composed of? What is the actual material? And then, the other aspect of it is what was the sampled feature that they were interested in. And that seemed to work for categorizing material samples at a really high level. But you can see in that work, we tried to keep those high level vocabularies on the order of 20 terms to try to keep them manageable, with the idea that then it being, RDF, that then you can have extensions. So we have several extension vocabularies for earth science materials and some archaeological materials, and in biology, where we have more specific categories that are in a SCOS vocabulary sense. Basically, they're narrower terms that link back to the broad terms in the high level vocabularies, with the idea that it provides a way things can be integrated at that high level if you're really working across these really just, some disparate domains: archaeology, biology, geoscience, environmental science, the different possibilities. So that's where that work is going, and then hopefully we can work together with the new RDA group and kind of move that forward.
By the way, I would emphasize that this work that we're doing in the W3C OGC ontology here, we don't have any expectation that people need or should use this as their implementation platform. You may choose to, and this is one of the advantages of the RDF framework, much maligned, is that an implementation drops right immediately out of it. But in many ways, my sort of motivations in pursuing this work and continuing it is really to provide a sort of conceptual framework to help people think through what it is they're trying to describe, which pieces are useful, and break it out and say, oh yeah, I hadn't realized I'd got all these different pieces potentially need to be addressed or described. Not every time, but in order to deal with some of the thorny cases of provenance, of the relationships and citations and things. It's what is it I'm trying that I want to cite here? Is it the sample, or is it the way the sample was obtained, or is it the campaign, which is basically a set of deployments, or was it the site, which is the platform in this language? So you almost certainly won't use this terminology directly, but there's a sort of a challenge to your honesty and explicitness in describing your systems, which in a sense we try and expose by saying, look, could you describe your thing this way, and have you learned anything about the way in which you were doing that you missed or that we missed?
One thing I can't figure out how to raise my hand in this Zoom meeting. Sorry.
It's under react, the heart. It's under the heart.
Oh, it's under the heart. Okay, well, I'll figure it out eventually. But anyway, oh, there we go. Okay. I just want one of the things that is kind of peripheral, but has come up in this iSamples realm where we're dealing with the Smithsonian and museum samples, where both in the Geome project and with museum samples, one of the big issues they deal with is this whole question of preservation. So you have the sample collection, and then there's this curation and sort of preservation part. And is that really part of the sampling process, or is that something separate?
Is preservation part of a sample preparation for archiving or something?
Right. So it's not really
something, Steve, something which came up halfway through our work on this revision of SSN is a bit of a oh shit, did we miss something here moment, when we thought, oh, is sampling just a kind of actuation?
Right. Okay.
Right.
And what was your
conclusion? We haven't bottomed that one out, Steve, but you can see where we might be going there, because actuation is where you're doing something to change the world. These various sample preparations and taking something now it is not solved in what we've done so far, but I know you can bounce up and down the abstraction chain, Steve, and I'm sure that one will press a button with you, right?
Yeah.
I can see Rolf nodding. Was nodding vigorously.
I mean, this is also interesting. So, I mean, sometimes you change things with the intention to have them changed.
Yeah.
Or otherwise, you might say change things intentionally, but so because you want to do something which happens to change the sample.
Yeah.
So we have also, say, operando experiments where we observe in an experiment how things change in the way.
Yes.
So you have a battery research. You have a cycler that charges and decharges the battery over and over. And the experiment consists of observing how the battery degrades.
Yep. Yep.
Of course, the cycling is not meant to degrade the battery.
Yeah.
It is meant to model some process somewhere else, and the degrading happens.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. I mean, the way in which we conceived actuation was that it changes a property of an entity, of a feature of interest. Okay. And that's where, at the moment, I don't think we can quite join together actuation and sampling. Because it's changing the identity of the feature of interest is a bit more what's going on in sampling. But I haven't thought this through fully yet. This is, and there's also a danger when going too abstract, is you leave the real world behind, don't you? And you leave practitioners behind. And I know that I have a tendency to go that direction. I can see through this and say, yes, you model that thing that she's grinning now, that we're trying to do. You could solve it with these little pieces here, and when it's all done, you nod and say, oh yeah, great, but it required seeing through those abstract classes and recognizing how in practice they operate in the world. And that's you end up using a whole lot of language which is pretty alien to the people in the lab or the field. Which is why I emphasize I don't necessarily expect people to implement systems directly based on this, but I think it's useful in I mean, you can, but a lot of its utility is challenging people to think clearly about what it is they've done, how to describe it, how many different things potentially merit having persistent identifiers within that system, and what the relationships between those are. I mean, this is what I was getting strongly from Joan, particularly, was the number of things which merit having identifiers in order to keep track of the whole scientific system, really. And if we have things which we want to give identifiers to, then we probably have some notion, this is what Rolf was talking about, of these things are classified in some way. We need to know what kind of things it is that we're giving identifiers to. So I'm throwing down on the table here a couple more kinds of things that you may not always have recognized were going on, and some of them are as the heavy duty ontologists call them, perdurance or occurrence. They're the events themselves merit having identifiers, okay, as well as the more static things which went in and come out at the other end, and then these intermediate things like platforms and deployments. So I'm seeing enough nods that it feels like it was worth talking this through a bit. So
no, it really was. It was great you talking us through and seeing how it had advanced, because you and I were involved way back in 2007, and I think, and I've often said, we had that original system developed by Rod Ryburn.
Yes.
In the early 90s, that site samples and outcrops, that was it.
Okay.
Okay. So are there any more questions of Simon? We'd really like to thank you, Simon, for making the time available to come and talk to us.
Yeah.
Because we're hoping to recharge the group. Kirsten, do you have any comments?
I have to say no. I'm fading away. I just came back a few hours ago from Europe, and it's 2 a.m. So.
Oh gosh.
You got through immigration, okay?
Yeah, that's the thing we were all worried about.
I think that adds to my tiredness, because I was kind of dreading the process, and I thought maybe, I run into trouble, but it was very smooth, surprisingly. But no, I wished I had been a little more alert, because what Simon showed was, a fantastic discussion that we had last year at the Dachstuhl workshop. And, I have appreciated the clarity in how to define a sample in this discussion where biodiversity has been in, because you realize the difference between what they define as specimens, which are often just locations or occurrences, and what we define as a real sample. So having that whole process of actually generating an object and so on. So I think it is incredibly useful, but it is on the edge of being so conceptual and theoretical that it's difficult to explain to everybody. And we need to do a good job, I think, in translating this into the real world use cases that we have. I'm happy to hear from Rolf or his, sort of from the perspective of a geologist, unusual use cases. But, I wish that we can engage more of the groups that are listed in what Leslie showed, that spreadsheet, because there are tissue samples in the medical sciences and so on. And it gives a lot more, a much bigger breadth of trying out what the conceptual model allows us to do. And really, Joan, I mean, it's fantastic. You dive into details that I always wipe away because they interfere sort of with efficient operation. And, it does show how much we really need to do to make it right. But, again, we need to figure out a way to make it easy for those who don't spend their life figuring out the data models and conceptual models of samples. So great discussions. I mean, great presentations. Thank you again. And, I think there is discussion going on. Leslie, you correct me if I'm wrong, discussions going on about having another session at IDW.
Well,
So,
oh, well, it's going to lead. I think we better start wrapping up. But one suggestion, so don't forget there's IDW, and it's whether or not we have a more formal session in that on samples. But for the next RDA plenary, which will also be at the same time, again, looking at all these groups, whether or not as a topic, we could get, say, archaeology, geology, the birds and the bees guys, tissues, to actually kind of walk us through their different ways of how they define a sample, and where the emphasis is, like as you said with biodiversity, it's more on the occurrence or the observation that something was there. You're not actually collecting a sample. But anyway, I think we'll hand over now to Esther. She's going to wrap it up. We did have one final slide. If someone could push that up, or Simon, are you able to just restart sharing your screen? I bet Kirsten's got a cat. I knew she was going to go and get a cat.
Simon's got the barking dog, and I've got the meowing cat here.
I also have a meowing cat, so apologies if that one starts to scream through whatever the wrap-up is. I actually have a very easy job to do a wrap-up because I think you already did my wrap-up in a sense. So I'm going to repeat what Simon said at the end about what are the number of identifiers that we need in order to keep track of everything in the scientific system? And then also, how do we classify things in order to know what kind of things we are giving identifiers to? I think that was a very, very good summary of our session. So just as a reminder, we really talked about sample citation based on the work by Joan and the ESIP group. So not just talking about citations and keeping track of them, but also talking about how can we keep track of subsamples within a bigger data set. And so if you're interested in that, please do click on all the links in the Google Doc and give it a read. We also talked about this higher level standardization vocabulary. And so there's another working group that you can join. And Rolf has copy pasted the link in the chat. The link is also in the notes. Thanks for scrolling down on the notes. I took some notes. There might be mistakes in those, so particularly if Simon can have a look if I actually documented this properly, please do correct if I did not, because some of it was indeed a bit high level for my side. I think I'm more of a practical use case person. So hopefully Simon will correct me where I got the documentation wrong. Yeah, so join Rolf's working group. Also a reminder to add your research to the catalog of groups or projects working on physical samples and their identifiers, so that Leslie shared that link at the very beginning of the session. The link is again at the end of the document. Leslie also already highlighted what our next session will be about, hopefully the 25th plenary already, where we hope to get together people from multiple disciplines to see how they see samples, how do they classify samples, what do their community of practices, what are they on about lately. And I, with a background as an archaeologist, can hopefully tell you more at that point if we're going to do a hybrid version of that session, because I won't be able to join in person. I think that may be it as a wrap up. Just a final request. If you want to become more involved in this working group, then please feel free to reach out to us. More involvement is always welcome.
Just quickly add that Esther was a European representative, but now she's moved to the Caribbean. We're not sure whether she's North America or South America yet, but there is an opportunity if someone would like to join as from Europe as a chair, so we get good spread of the continents. At the moment, we've got North America, Australia, and let's call you South America covered. We'd be good if someone wanted to join from Europe, it would be really good. So other than that, thank you everyone for coming. I hope you got a lot out of the session. I'll remember to save the chat and look forward to seeing you either hybrid or in person in Brisbane.
Yeah, let's hope that we can travel.
Yes.
Thank you, Leslie,
Thank you.
Kirsten.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you for the very inspiring session.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Oh,
Hey.
time to feed the dog.
Oh, another puppy dog. It's raining cats and dogs.
Oh, you're so cute. Oh my God. Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Oh my God.